Hello and welcome back to Fixing Fallout 3. This is part 7 in a series where we take the vanilla story of Fallout 3 and touch up the writing, role-playing, and world-building elements to make it the equal of some of the franchise's other titles. If you're at all interested in how we got here, make sure to check out the earlier episodes first. But as a quick recap, we just braved the simulated nightmare of Tranquility Lane to find our estranged father. The only person who the Overseer thought might know why the Enclave attacked Vault 101 in the beginning of the game. And the only man in the Wasteland who can explain why you were abandoned as an orphan in the Vault in the first place. The vertibird ride back to Jefferson Island was a long one. You learned that the man who you thought was your father, the guy who we've been searching for this entire time, is not actually your dad. That's right. In this version of Fallout 3, Liam Neeson is not your dad. Not really. Instead, he was only the man who rescued you as an orphan child in the Wasteland, and brought you with him on his cross-country trek from California. This pretty heavily implied that our character, the Lone Wanderer, is the biological child of the Chosen One, the protagonist of Fallout 2. And this is in keeping with the theme of familiar relation between the protagonists of Fallout 1 and 2. It creates a pretty direct sense of continuity with the classic games that I think Fallout 3 was always missing. It also frees our character up to have any sort of relationship with James that we want. This is a role-playing game after all, and by removing the father-son backstory from the beginning of the game, it gave us the opportunity of letting the player craft their own relationship with their surrogate father through their dialogue and choices. We even allowed you the option of killing James as soon as he was released from the simulation, if we couldn't talk him down from paranoid frenzy. And as we'll soon find out, there are other ways of completing the story that don't involve interacting with him at all. That's right, we could have left James to rot in Tranquility Lane for the rest of eternity, and still have found a way to complete the main story. But for simplicity's sake, we've been following this questline as it's the route that will explain the most of the backstory on a first-time playthrough. This is also the path that will be heavily incentivized through dialogue. So basically it's on guardrails, but hopefully ones that aren't too obtrusive. So far, our current choices have led us here. As the vertibird touches down on Jefferson Island, the location of the Brotherhood-run Project Purity, we finally get our first introduction to this faction. Remember, we replaced their presence in downtown DC with Riley's Rangers, so we haven't actually formally met the Brotherhood yet. We've heard about them plenty, but nothing we've done so far has really put us on their radar. The big dogs in power armor just have better fish to fry than little people like us. And if we previously tried approaching their bases in Project Purity or the Citadel, we were quickly shown the door. So far, all we know about the Brotherhood and their mission in the Capital Wasteland is what we've heard from the Rangers. They arrived suddenly, breaking the mutant siege of the Citadel at the 11th hour, and saving the Capital Wasteland from the ravages of the mutant plague. But whatever humanitarian intentions they had, it seemingly ended there. They expelled the diminished remnants of the Rangers from the Pentagon and set up shop, running a silent and mysterious operation for the last 15 years. But as you'll recall, the schism between Lion's chapter and the Brotherhood outcasts recently occurred. So clearly something is happening behind closed doors. And our first clue to Lion's grand plan for the Capital Wasteland is at the Project Purity installation. Yet, unlike our introduction in the vanilla game, this time we are shown a glimpse of the project as it's in full swing. This way we avoid all the lame busywork that we were forced to do when we first arrived. That's basically there just to give the impression of the passage of time while the scientists are setting up shop. In our version, scientists and laborers already swarm the island, busily rebuilding the Jefferson Memorial into one large megastructure. This is matched by the significant military presence on the island, protecting the site from any threats. As we'll soon find out, Project Purity is the Brotherhood's main investment in the Capital Wasteland, for obvious reasons. Even including Project Purity might seem like a bit of a bold choice for our rewrite. So far, we've mostly avoided the whole Waters of Life theme that the vanilla game set up with James's motivations. And while I've seen a lot of rewrites of Fallout 3 that suggest making water insecurity a much more pressing issue, to try and hammer in that motivation for the player through any means possible, to make reactivating the purifier actually satisfying at the end of the game, I actually think this is the wrong approach. So far, we actually have presented water insecurity as an important factor in faction politics, by just mirroring the vanilla game. Really, we don't even have to do much work here. Every settlement in the wasteland basically lives or dies by its access to water purification. That's why more gimmicky settlements like Megaton or Rivet City even exist. And any player who is actively engaged in learning more about the world of Fallout 3 would have already realized this connection. But we aren't shoving it down the player's throat. So basically, we're relying on the world building to have already set up the idea of water insecurity to the player. And I think this approach will be our best bet in the long run anyway. And even though the whole water subplot can get pretty clunky, far weaker in my opinion than even the initial motivation of finding your father, I just couldn't bring myself to throw it out entirely. I think there's actually a way we can salvage the back half of Fallout 3's story and still fit it in neatly with a lot of the thematic elements that we've been teeing up in the rewrite so far. So just bear with me, the picture will start to become clearer soon. But as we make our way towards the heart of the operation, we are met by a familiar face, Dr. Madison Lee. We get to witness her fiery reunion with James that will go down pretty similarly to how it does in the vanilla game. She's initially amazed to even see him alive, especially because in our version he's been gone for 18 years. But her relief soon turns to anger, as they clash about Project Purity and their competing visions for it. In vanilla, this is when James begs Lee to help him restart the project. But in our version, we don't actually know what this conflict is over yet. From what it sounds like, Lee has been running the project for the last 15 years, getting it off the ground by convincing the Brotherhood to sponsor it. But it was never her idea to begin with. Just like in the vanilla game, it was James's wife, Catherine, who originally created the project. And from his explosive argument with Lee, it sounds like it was never her intention to consign power over the water purifier to a faction like the Brotherhood of Steel. Whatever Lee is doing for them, it wasn't the original plan. But that's a whole can of worms that we'll have to unpack later. Tensions cool as we're reminded of the urgency of our situation. James fled to Tranquility Lane after he discovered proof of the Enclave's survival during his expedition to Raven Rock 18 years ago. And you can confirm, as you now know, it was the Enclave who raided Vault 101, all the way back at the beginning of the game. These two signs very clearly point towards their imminent reemergence, and the Brotherhood is probably the only force in the wasteland capable of fighting back against this resurgent threat. Lyons has to be warned. Okay, so let's pause a second. We have a lot of ground to cover here. Who is Dr. Lee in our version of events? Who is Catherine? What was her vision for Project Purity? And how has Lee's deal with the Brotherhood compromised it? How is the Brotherhood even here in the first place? And what do they want with Project Purity? As the scripted sequence ends, we'll give the player free rein to ask all these questions and more. These next few conversations are going to be very important, as they're going to help us put most of the pieces together, finally giving us the full picture of the conflict that's brewing in the Capital Wasteland. And our players' conclusions about this conflict will shape their motivations for the rest of the game. So we better make sure that we get this next sequence right, by giving the player every opportunity that they need to ask any questions that they want. This is why it's best to have James here on a first-time playthrough, so that we have all the exposition we need to help ace this critical story pivot. So starting with Lee, who is she? Well, we can gather that she has a long history with James, one which we're naturally going to be fleshing out to fit in with his new backstory.
NANI?!
In our version, she was once an Enclave scientist, a low-level hydrologist and radiologist who was assigned to studying groundwater contamination on the continent, but also one extremely gifted in her field, jaded by the lack of opportunities that the rigid hierarchy of life on the oil rig provided. She was the science officer in James's squad when they defected from the Enclave, just before its destruction. And if you really press her, she might even reveal some lingering resentment at this decision. But that was a long time ago. Lee was actually the only other member of James's group to survive their cross-country odyssey. Which includes yourself, of course. But you were only an infant at the time, and you have no memories of life outside the vault. Speaking of the vault, she was actually the one who repaired the vault's water chip, while James made a backdoor deal with the Overseer to give you a new life in Vault 101. Their rationale was mostly the same as in the vanilla game. They genuinely thought that this would be the best place for you, sheltered away from the horrors of the wasteland. But that also meant orphaning you. And like with James, we can give the player the option of feeling jaded about this decision. She was also part of the expedition to Raven Rock, whose footsteps we retraced in Part 5 of this series, though she was injured early, forcing the group to leave her behind, meaning that she never actually learned what became of the Enclave like James did. And this is where some of that open-ended quest structure that I mentioned earlier comes back into play. If you'll remember, in that episode, Three Dog actually told us to go to Dr. Lee for information first. But if we approached Project Purity, we were turned away by the Brotherhood. With no way to reach her, we were forced to pursue other leads. Unless we actually complied with the Brotherhood's impossible demands by going and finding a Gek for them. This sequence break would take us to Vault 87 early, which we haven't covered yet in this series, but it would basically cut out all the legwork that we've done in the last 2 episodes, giving us earlier access to Project Purity, only without ever having to interact with James or Tranquility Lane. Although this option would still remain as a side quest. We wouldn't be locking it off. The player would have to actively be choosing not to engage in it. But what about Project Purity? What is it, and how come Lee is running it? Well, after James's disappearance, she had assumed that he was dead. Believing that the search for the Enclave remnants had always been a wild goose chase, she wandered the wasteland aimlessly for years, emotionally broken, until the mutant plague and the arrival of the Brotherhood virtually upended life in the capital wasteland. Her work on helping various settlements deal with the shock of the plague brought her back into the scientific field, and it inspired her to translate her grief into scientific passion, reviving the idea for Project Purity by securing a sponsorship from the Brotherhood and getting work on the project rolling. That might explain some of that explosive argument with James that we heard earlier. Her relief at seeing him alive after all this time soon turned to indignity as he ruthlessly criticized her vision of the project. She thought keeping the idea alive was a fitting tribute to James and Catherine, but clearly he sees things differently. So Lee is the one who's been running Project Purity for the last 15 years, getting it off the ground and putting together the workforce to construct the mega project. But the inception of Project Purity actually stems from a different character, one who we're never actually going to be meeting. In Fallout 3, Catherine is the Lone Wanderer's mother, who dies in childbirth at the very beginning of the game. We only ever hear a couple voice lines from her, but as James repeatedly mentions, Project Purity and the dream of free, clean water for all was actually her vision. His unresolved grief is what motivates him to revive the project, and his sudden exit from the vault is what motivates us to follow him into the wasteland. Now, in our rendition, we cut out any mention of her from the beginning, along with, well, everything else in the intro sequence. And we've given you an entirely different trail of breadcrumbs leading up to finding your father. So this presents a bit of a problem. Introducing James as the mind behind Project Purity at this point would be narratively difficult, to say the least. We gave him an entirely new backstory that emphasizes his talents as a soldier and as a leader, rather than as a medical doctor like he was in the vanilla game. And that's not even mentioning that he was trapped in Tranquility Lane for the last 18 years. He's probably much more concerned with opposing the Enclave than he is about water security in the capital wasteland. So with James as the mind behind the project, we would have never had the opportunity to introduce an active Project Purity. And Dr. Lee, Well, I don't really think that this sort of utopian vision is really in her character. Sure, she's a genius scientist and a great steward for the project, who will work tirelessly to see it completed, but that's probably more due to her own sense of rigid perfectionism and lingering loyalty to James than out of any true altruism. And besides, her agreement with the Brotherhood probably implies their inclusive use of the project when it's finished, a complete bastardization of its original vision. So that leaves us Catherine, and introducing her now might seem a bit awkward, especially since we just learned that she wasn't even our biological mother. But I think we could have littered the dialogue with enough mentions by now to at least introduce her as a concept to the player. She was never our focus, but learning from the Overseer that our father was alive, and that he came from outside the vault, might have naturally led us to question if the same was true about our mother. We could have asked Moriarty or Three Dog or any of the characters we met on the way to James about her, but they would have all said the same thing. She died in childbirth sometime before they ever met your father. But now that we've met James and Dr. Lee, the only two people in the wasteland who actually knew her, we can finally find out more about her. Who was she? What was her vision for Project Purity? And if she wasn't our mother, whose child did she die giving birth to? Well, like Lee, Catherine was a scientist, a hydrologist who specialized in groundwater sciences. But she was never a part of the Enclave. Instead, she was from a control vault, one that James's group encountered during their cross-country trek from California. Vault 234 housed descendants of the Environmental Protection Agency, a pre-war government agency that, as the name suggests, had once specialized in environmental sciences. Before the war, the agency had degenerated into a cabal of yes-men who only existed to greenlight any of the government's increasingly drastic resource extraction projects, giving them the veneer of environmentalist approval. But 200 years later, the descendants of those who sheltered in the control vault had overcorrected by developing somewhat of a rigid scientific tradition. The scientists of Vault 234 were earmarked as VIPs for the Enclave, to be extracted at the earliest opportunity during their recolonization of the continent. And this put the Vault on James's radar during his cross-country journey. When he arrived at the Vault, seeking refuge in any news from the other branches of the Enclave, he found out that the extraction had never come. The Midwest and East Coast branches of the Enclave had never even made contact. And while the inhabitants of the Vault were disappointed to hear about the destruction of the oil rig, and they were glad to give shelter to James's group for a while, other than that, they wanted little to do with the exiles. That was except for one. Like you, Catherine had spent her entire life inside the Vault, dreaming of what life was like on the outside. When James announced his intentions to leave and press on towards the capital, she immediately volunteered to go with him. But the wasteland wasn't at all like she expected. Her first experiences with the horrors of life outside the Vault actually cultivated a deep-rooted sense of altruism that was a pretty explicit rejection of the culture of cold, cynical, scientific detachment that her people had developed over the years, leading to her almost utopian goal of free, clean water for all. Her naive optimism made her stick out like a sore thumb in the nihilistic hellscape of the wastes, but it quickly endeared her to her companions, and she and James soon fell in love. She even became somewhat of a surrogate mother to you, even though you have no memories of your time in the wasteland. Throughout their long journey, Catherine put her scientific knowledge to use, consistently observing water scarcity everywhere they went. She eventually developed a hypothesis with earth-shattering ramifications. Unlike in the West, complex societies were virtually non-existent on the East Coast, and Catherine thought she could actually pinpoint why this was the case. It's because virtually the entire watershed of the eastern half of the United States would have been heavily irradiated by the war, much more than other regions of the country. In the West, even before the war, communities primarily sourced their water from groundwater sources, which are far safer from the effects of radiation, while Eastern communities primarily sourced their water from freshwater lakes and rivers, even today, which would have been much more heavily contaminated by nuclear fallout. The far higher scarcity of drinkable water in the post-nuclear eastern United States was what was heavily handicapping the regrowth of communities. It was enough to hold back the reemergence of civilization for over a century after the West had already begun to develop complex societies and even empires. This is actually a massive plot point for the world building. It's how we justify the disparity in technology and societal organization between Western and Eastern Fallout. Although, in real terms, this is just to give BGS the blank slate that they need to import factions from the West Coast, while starting their own original factions at square one. But it also becomes important to the story of Fallout 3, as this discovery was what inspired Catherine to develop the idea of Project Purity in the first place. Having come from the Vault, she knew all about the GEC program. She knew that this miraculous technology existed somewhere, and that it could potentially have the power to purify the entire watershed of the East Coast, if it was strategically located. So when her group finally arrived in the Capital Wasteland, she decided that the tidal basin of the Potomac River was as good a location as any for her dream project. It took a lot of convincing, but she eventually won over James, and she even managed to interest Dr. Lee with the feasibility of her idea. But before the work on the project could begin, she was set to give birth. Caring for you as an infant for almost a year had inspired her to want to have children of her own. Tragically, though, she died during a miscarriage, just like she does in the beginning of Fallout 3. And this is a very painful memory for James and Dr. Lee. If you try to ask them about it, they'll be kind of evasive. With Catherine's death, so died her vision for Project Purity. Neither could bring themselves to start working on the massive task, and a heartbroken James found that he no longer had the stomach to even be a father. This is when he decided to drop you off in Vault 101, while he continued his almost suicidal quest to search for the remnants of the East Coast Enclave. So there you go. Hopefully the backstory has finally come together enough to catch us up to where we would be at this point in the vanilla Fallout 3 campaign. And I'm sorry if all this exposition comes off as a little long-winded and clunky, but this character writing has to do a lot of heavy lifting here, and I really wanted to take the time to get it right. The history between James, Catherine, and Dr. Lee, and their work on Project Purity, forms the expositional backbone of the Fallout 3 campaign from here on out. And it will end up informing our characters' motivations for the rest of the game. So I wanted to take the time and give these characters the intricate backstories that they deserve, something equal to their importance to the story, and something that will also serve as an introduction for the player to many of the background lore elements that will gradually become more important as the campaign progresses. Remember, we always positioned our rewrite as a soft reboot of the Fallout universe, putting ourselves in the shoes of Bethesda's writers back in 2007. So we've handled the story so far as if our player was completely new to the world of Fallout. So while James's backstory served as an introduction to the Enclave, Lee's work with the Brotherhood introduces us to them, and Catherine's story introduced us to Project Purity. I think it actually ties itself up pretty neatly in the end. But what do we do with all this information? Where does the story go from here? I mean, we've won, right? We found our dad and we got the ball rolling on the beginnings of an anti-Enclave resistance. Well, yeah, no. Unlike the new players that we're creating this hypothetical rewrite for, we've all played Fallout 3 before, and we know that it's time for the Enclave to make their grand entrance. Are you starting to notice the pattern yet? So far, we've managed to include all the major set-piece moments of Fallout 3, pretty similarly to how they play out in the vanilla game, only we've spent most of our time on the rewrite, rearranging a lot of the quest design and world building, so that those moments play out with a lot more punch. So when it comes to the Enclave attack on Project Purity, I don't think we actually have to change much here. As a plot beat and as a set piece, the attack on Project Purity is actually a fairly competent bit of storytelling in my opinion. and it's always stood out in my mind as one of the best moments in Fallout 3's campaign. We're still relying on it heavily as a major plot hinge for our story. It will round out the major plot thread of the first half of the game with James's death, and it will tee up the brewing conflict that will form the backbone of the latter half of the story. So I don't want to change any of that. And I'm not going to take too much time rewriting anything here, only tweaking elements so that it fits in better with our sequence of events. But right off the bat, we have a problem. When does the attack begin? We cut out all the busy work that's really there just to give the impression of the passage of time by changing Project Purity into an active construction. And I think that would be a bit too cliche for the attack to happen while we're in the middle of dialogue with Dr. Lee. I mean, we just flew in right off the back of another major action-packed set piece during our escape from Vault 112. We need to give the player at least a little time to decompress from that, so that we can actually build up a false sense of security that will be shattered by the sudden invasion. And while this would most likely come through several very lengthy dialogue trees with James and Dr. Lee that would cover all the exposition we walked through earlier, there's nothing guaranteeing that the player will engage with that, especially on a repeat playthrough. So I'm going to do something that's a little taboo by my standards here, and have our players sleep to pass the time, once they're done debriefing with James and Dr. Lee. I know, this might seem shockingly cliched, a complete betrayal of the high standards of player agency that we've set for our rewrite, a clunky quest objective, and a huge red flag that anyone would see coming from a mile away, almost like something you would see in a modern BGS game. But to be honest, I just can't think of anything better. Hey, bite me, alright? Plot holes happen to everyone. So let me know in the comments if you can think of a better scene transition. I'll be interested to hear what you can come up with. But anyway, the next morning, Lee wakes us up in a panic. Last night, when she radioed in your report of the Enclave's reemergence, the Citadel went radio silent. Until this morning, when Lyons inexplicably gave the call to evacuate all Brotherhood military personnel from the island, leaving the scientists virtually defenseless, just as a fleet of Enclave vertibirds appeared on the horizon. The attack is already underway, and you'll have to fight your way out of the subterranean personnel quarters and up into the main rotunda, hopefully to find James, regroup, and evacuate. Although keep in mind that this entire sequence would play out differently if James wasn't here. I won't have time to cover that scenario in this episode, but know that this is an option. So you know how this all goes down. We'll give the players some sweeping wide shots of the fleet of vertibirds landing outside the memorial, just a taste of the overwhelming firepower that the Enclave is using for the occupation. Then we'll give them some limited combat encounters that will see them face off against their first enemies in power armor. Because remember, we rescaled power armor so that it's rarer and tougher, meaning that anyone with it is essentially a mini-boss, unless you have high caliber ballistics or specialized pulse weaponry. So fighting just one or two Enclave soldiers should actually act as a pretty big glow up for our character. Way back at the start of the game, we weren't strong enough to fight the power armored troops raiding Vault 101. We could only run or hide to avoid detection. So being able to defeat them now, even only in small numbers, should serve as a major benchmark for our character's power progression into the mid-game. But when the player finally makes their way into the rotunda, we lock them into a scripted sequence that should play out mostly the same as vanilla. James would rather see the project destroyed than allow it to fall into the hands of the Enclave. So he triggers a radiation leak in the main chamber, contaminating the purifier and killing everyone inside the control center. This time though, we get one last chance to talk to him through the door, Star Trek II style. He reiterates Catherine's wish for the water purifier, and he begs you to stop the Enclave at any cost, or any other faction who would seek to pervert that vision. As James slowly succumbs to radiation behind the glass, we can choose to accept his wishes or rebuke them.
You sick, vindictive fuck!
But it's probably best to humor him, at least for now. Otherwise, he won't share with us his final revelation. See, there's one more secret that James has been hiding.
There is another sky.
That's right, he lied to you. Catherine's child didn't die during the miscarriage. She survived and entered Vault 101 with you. He couldn't talk about it before, it was just too painful a memory to share, and his guilt for abandoning her, his trueborn child, was probably much greater than his guilt for leaving you. But as his dying wish, he begs us to seek her out, to rescue our surrogate sibling from the clutches of the Enclave and protect Catherine's legacy. She holds the key, he says. He doesn't wait for an answer. Then he's gone. Soon, the radiation is starting to spill out from the control room and contaminate the entire site. You need to leave, now. But the reactor meltdown has brought you just enough time to escape while the Enclave's main force is disoriented. You follow Lee and the surviving scientists into the Taft tunnels, making your way towards the Citadel. It's not an easy route. The old sewer system is infested with mutated creatures, and the Enclave is hot on your heels, trying to recapture the runaway scientists. You make your way past
the Truman Cocaine Lounge, the McKinley Hooker Dump, and the Lincoln Slave Coliseum
to a locked door, the entrance to the underground Pentagon complex. Lee is furious, ranting to the intercom about Lyon's betrayal. You make your last stand as an overwhelming force bears down on you. It starts to look grim, until finally the doors open. You rush inside just as the tunnels flood behind you. You've made it to safety. And the end of the video. Sorry folks, but we're gonna have to end it here. I think I've rambled on long enough for one segment. My bad. I know I teased an entirely different premise for part 7 back in the last video, but I kinda goofed and thought that I could cover the attack on Project Purity in just a couple minutes, while we sprinted on to cover the new interesting stuff. And we're not even done yet. We've still got a ton of ground to cover when we finally get to meet Lyon's Brotherhood in the next episode. We'll have to debrief all the crazy shit that just went down, and talk more about how this major story pivot will affect the tone of the main campaign. So stay tuned for that. Should be heading your way next month sometime. But yeah, that's going to do it for this one. What do you think of my Fallout 3 rewrite so far? Make sure to check out parts 1 through 6 if you're interested in catching up. And hey, let me know where you think we can go from here. What parts of Fallout 3 would you change if you had the chance? Let me know in the comments. I look forward to hearing it. Bye bye now.